This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for the 51st edition of Deck History. In this series, I trace the development of historically significant Magic decks from their origins to the current day. As usual, I give you, the viewers, a chance to vote for what the topic of this week's video would be, and I gave my audience two spooky choices: Recurring Nightmare decks or Spirit Tribal. In the end, Recurring Nightmare decks won out. Don't fret if you're a Spirit fan though, as I'll be covering Spirits in next week's video. It has lost a lot of polls at this point, and covering it during Halloween seems like the right time to do it. Recurring Nightmare is also a good deck to look at this time of year, since the card's flavor is all about experiencing frightening nightmares. Nightmares that seem to be physically manifesting themselves, as you can see in the art. In particular, we're going to be looking at recurring survival decks. Recurring Nightmare is almost always played alongside Survival of the Fittest, giving the deck its name. These decks excel at tutoring up whatever creatures they want to with Survival of the Fittest, and reanimating creatures with Recurring Nightmare. The debut of recurring survival decks in Block and Standard represented an important first in the history of Magic. It was the game's first Toolbox deck. Additionally, while it wasn't the first Reanimator deck, it was the first deck that could get reanimation online with ease, showcasing a new level of power for reanimation decks. The combination of Survival of the Fittest and Recurring Nightmare was so powerful that the deck was banned out of existence almost immediately after making its debut in Standard. In addition to that brief time in Standard, recurring survival decks have also found success in Block and Legacy, and in this video we'll cover all of those decks and how they changed over time. So, the story of recurring survival begins at Worlds in 1998, an event at which the recurring survival deck made its debut in both Block and Standard. First, let's take a look at what the deck looked like in Tempest Block Constructed. Unsurprisingly, both Recurring Nightmare and Survival of the Fittest are the core of the deck. Individually, these enchantments are quite powerful. Recurring Nightmare lets you reanimate a creature, and you can do it for only 3 mana. You do also have to sacrifice a creature, but you also get Nightmare back in your hand, so you can just do it all over again. Meanwhile, Survival of the Fittest allows you to discard a creature card to search up any creature card from your deck. As powerful as they are alone, they are even more incredible together. Survival is a discard outlet to get reanimation targets into your graveyard, and Survival can help you search up things you want to reanimate in the first place. It was a match made in Magic Heaven. What's more is, after you tutor up a creature with a useful ability, you can also reanimate it again later in the game if you want that ability again. On that note, one of the things you'll immediately notice about this deck is how many singleton creatures are in it. The deck is loaded up with various utility creatures that you can search up with Survival of the Fittest when the time is right. This is what I mean when I say Toolbox deck. These utility creatures are your tools. This allows the deck to take advantage of cards that are good in specific situations without compromising the deck. You don't want too many copies of a card that hates on artifacts in most matchups, but you can search it up whenever you need it. This gives the deck a massive amount of flexibility. That means it can respond to almost anything by searching up the ideal card. More recent decks that have heavy toolbox strategies include Birthing Pod and Court of Calling decks, while other decks have toolbox elements to them, like Hate Bear, Death and Taxes, and Legacy Lands. And this is the toolbox deck that started it all. So let's take a look at some of these toolbox creatures. If your opponent has a problem enchantment, and at this event that probably meant another Survival of the Fittest or Recurring Nightmare, you could take it out with Cloud Chaser Eagle. If you wanted to get back a card of one type or another, you could grab Rootwater Diver or Anarchist. If you needed to buy yourself more time, you could search up Spike Feeder or Spike Weaver, which gained you life and fogged the board respectively. And if you needed to kill a creature, you could get your Stronghold Assassin. If you felt the need to disrupt your opponent, you could grab your Thrall Surgeon. And lastly, Trade Wind Rider was a powerful option once you had an established board presence, as it made it very difficult for your opponent to keep anything on the board. So that's the deck's toolbox. Let's talk now about the reanimation angle. The deck's main reanimation target was Verdant Force, who could represent a major problem if you got it into play early. A huge creature that spits out saplings every turn is pretty awesome. This deck also had some additional ways to load the graveyard and take advantage of it. In particular, it could use Hermit Druid to load up the graveyard and cast Living Death to reanimate everything in it. And Coffin Queen gave you a tutorable way to reanimate creatures too. So that's what the block version of Recurring Survival looked like. Let's now move to the standard portion of the very same World Championship, where 4 different players piloted Recurring Survival decks to top 8 finishes, including the deck that won the whole event in the hands of Brian Selden. It won't surprise you that Recurring Nightmare and Survival of the Fittest appear as full 4-ofs in this deck. The deck also features some of the same Toolbox creatures from the block constructed format, but because the deck had access to a larger card pool, there are some more powerful utility creatures in the deck, so let's talk about them. If there was an artifact you were concerned about, Uktabi Orangutan could take care of it. If you needed to kill or bounce a creature, you could find Manowar or Necrotal. And if you wanted to cripple your opponent's mana base, you could search up Orcish Settlers. Those were the cards that the standard version of the deck liked to tutor up. The rest of the Toolbox creatures in this deck are the same as we saw in Block Constructed. Now, let's take a look at the deck's reanimation side. The standard version of the deck also uses Verdant Force, just like the block version did, but it also had access to an even better reanimation target, Spirit of the Night. At the time, there's a pretty good argument that Spirit of the Night was simply the most powerful creature in the entire game, at least in a vacuum. And what I mean is, once it got in play, however it got in play, it could dominate the game more than any other creature could. It offered big stats, protection from the best removal color, flying, trample, haste, and even first strike when it attacked. This meant it was difficult to remove and virtually impossible to block effectively, and it represented a very fast clock, and this deck was very capable of reanimating it on turn 3. You had to play a Birds of Paradise on turn 1, Survival of the Fittest on turn 2, and discard the Spirit and search something up, and then you could cast Recurring Nightmare on turn 3 to reanimate the Spirit. Even if you didn't have the Spirit in your hand, you could pull it off on turn 3 if you had a turn 1 Birds of Paradise. You just had to search it up first and then discard it. Because there's a tutor involved, it really wasn't that hard to find Spirit of the Night for this turn 3 play. And all in all, the standard version of this deck was too fast and too consistent, and it was something of a recurring nightmare for players. It could try to win the game incredibly early, and if that didn't work out, well, it could just search up powerful creatures with good abilities that disrupted the opponent, before then just winning the long game. This would go on to be a problem with future Toolbox decks too, like Birthing Pod, which could search up an instant win combo or just win the game by tutoring stuff up. The ability to operate on these two different axes made it so the deck basically didn't have any weaknesses in Standard. As a result, Recurring Nightmare got banned out of Standard. This weakened the deck significantly, and obviously made it so it really didn't exist anymore. Decks now were just interested in playing Survival of the Fittest, and the reanimation angle was gone. However, that didn't bring about the end of recurring survival decks everywhere. After all, both of these cards were still legal in Legacy. In 2005, Luca Verdiani piloted his recurring survival deck to a top 8 finish at Grand Prix Lille. His deck leaned more into the survival of the fittest side of things and a little less into the reanimation side of things, as you can see from the fact that his deck runs only a single copy of Recurring Nightmare. However, the deck did run an impressive reanimation target in the form of a Chroma Angel of Wrath, who was a lot like Spirit of the Night from all those years ago, but even better. In terms of the survival side of things, the deck now had access to Squee Goblin Nabob, which is a powerful combo because instead of having to give up an actual creature card, you could just discard Squee every turn to your survival and return him to your hand every turn. The deck's toolbox looks different too, of course. Loxodon Hierarch and Ravenous Baloth could give you sizable creatures that could gain you life. Bone Shredder gave you a better way to destroy creatures, Eternal Witness let you get cards back from the graveyard, and Withered Wretch let you hate on opposing graveyards, while Viridian Shaman could destroy problem artifacts. 2007 would be the last time a recurring survival deck top-8'd a major event. That year, Christian Houtgen piloted his deck to a first-place finish at the German Legacy Championship. One of the sweetest things about his version of the deck is the inclusion of Academy Rector, who can be used to search up either of the deck's powerful enchantments. Survival of the Fittest decks have continued to be a thing in Legacy even today, and at some point in this series, I'll have to do a video covering that type of deck more broadly. But for now, that's the history of recurring Nightmare decks. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the over 50 other episodes of this series, You should see the playlist on your screen shortly, and if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron, a channel member, or by buying Nitsa Hone merchandise, all of which you can do by following some links in the description. Thanks for watching.